Well, good evening. Hi, it's me with the Bailey fam. We're here to read On the Edge of the Dark Sea of Darkness. We started with chapter 1 without recording it. I read chapter 2 a couple weeks ago. We've taken a break, and now we're reading chapter 3 today. And so, bear with me, and we'll go through this. Chapter 3, Thwaps in a Sack. I believe it's pronounced thwaps. That's how I'm going to pronounce it. It might be thwops, but I'm going to go with thwaps, because it sounds funnier. Lily's one-legged grandfather was on his knees growling at something in the garden. Fat red potatoes hung from the vines. Round heads of lettuce burst quietly from the ground in long rows. Sprouts of grenions, carrots, and sugarberries, her favorite, were yet bright and dewy. Like Lily, Poto got along fine with only one leg, though instead of using a crutch, he strapped on a wooden stump below the knee. He never talked about how he had lost his leg, but it was no secret that he had been a pirate in his wild youth, and he entertained his grandchildren nightly with tales of his adventures at sea. Like the time all 18 of his crew fell ill from eating a batch of bad ponkfin they had looted from a fishing boat near the Foob Islands, Poto was the only one who hadn't eaten any and was left to sail the ship alone through a storm while his crew sloshed about moaning in the hull. "And that's not the worst of it," Poto would say. "I tell ye, that was with the screen navy hot on me stern, cannons firing and arrows whizzing through me hair. That's how come in pots in 3 places, see? Still can't catch a whiff of ponkfin when I don't get the urge to trim sail and run for cover." The Ickaby children would squeal with delight, and old Poto often got so worked up that he'd need to dab the sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. He was wiping his brow with the handkerchief now as he squinted through the grenion sprouts. "Grandpa," Lily said from behind him. Poto whipped his head round, waving a naughty wooden club at her. That's naughty with a K. His long white hair was frazzled, and he looked like a mad old hag. Watch yourself, lass. I like to have banged you on the head with me, whopper." His white, bushy eyebrows shot up, and he held a gnarled finger to his lips. "Thwaps, thwaps," he hissed. Suddenly, a small, hairy figure leapt out from beneath a potato plant and squealed. Poto bounded after it. Nugget, who had been whining happily, lost all restraint and pounded into the garden with a bark. The common thwap was a little bigger than a skunk. We have a footnote here for a skunk. Bip Thwainby, the chomping of the skunk, publisher and date unknown. I guess he gives us the information about the skunk. It's not much more than a ball of fur with skinny arms and legs standing as high as the middle of Poto's remaining shin. The old man's club found its target and sent the little critter flying through the air, but not before another one darted out of the garden and bit Poto fiercely on his stump with its long yellow teeth. The first thwap crashed into the trunk of a nearby tree and dropped to the ground, where it immediately stood up and hurled a pebble at the old man. It struck Poto squarely in the forehead, and he staggered for a moment, shaking his head while he beat at the thwap whose teeth were stuck in his wooden leg. The thwaps squealed and darted back into the garden. A moment later they reappeared, one with a potato in its furry paws, the other with an armful of carrots. They dodged another swipe from Poto's club and shot into the garden again. Poto roared and swung his club above his head. "Avast, foul rodents!" A gust of wind moved the garden leaves in waves. Poto's white hair flew out behind him, and he leaned into the breeze with a fierce set of his jaw. A thwap appeared from behind a sugarberry plant and threw another rock. Poto swung his club and sent the stone zipping back into the garden as the thwaps dove for cover. "Aha!" A few moments passed as the thwaps squeaked and twittered among themselves. Poto's face wrinkled even tighter. He lowered his club and cupped a hand over his ear as if he could have understood them. Suddenly, a fat red potato whizzed through the air and burst on Poto's face. "Not the potatoes!" Poto blinked the juice from his eyes and batted another potato away from his club. "Not my potatoes!" Just as Lily turned away, she saw him dive into the garden, head first, howling all the while. She smiled and limped back to the cottage, which was thick with the smell of breakfast. Nia tromped past her to the garden without a word, snatched 2 leaves from a rose pepper plant, and returned to the kitchen, ignoring Nugget's barking. Poto's howls of rage and the thwaps sailing through the air. Janner, who had finally managed to clean the manure from his face and hair, walked back to the house, dripping wet. Tink, skinny as a rake, sat at the table beside Lily. His eyes were fixed on a large pile of sausage sizzling on the stove, and the sound of his growling stomach filled the room. "Well, that's better." Nia folded her arms and tried not to smile at Janner. "I thought I'd see you with fresh grass growing on your face by now." Janner blushed and shook his head as he took his seat. Lily and Tink tried to hide their giggles as Nia pulled up a chair and sat with her elbows on the table and her chin in her hands, watching her children eat. Janner stared out the window deep in his thoughts. Tink hunched over his plate like a buzzard, eating the hotcakes and sausage as if they might try to escape. Lily watched her brothers and fidgeted with the hem of her Lily watched her brothers and fidgeted with the hem of her gown, humming and bobbing her head back and forth while she chewed. "Eat well, my dears. It's going to be a busy day," Nia said, smiling. The children's eyes widened. "The sea dragons!" they cried in unison. Nia laughed and pushed herself up from the table. "The summer dusk hath split in twain the gilded summer moon, and all who come shall hear again the dragon's golden tune," she sang. That's from the Legend of the Sunken Mountains, a traditional screen rhyme. A later version of the tale was printed in Isaac Fincher's Comprehensive History of Sad, Sad Songs. See page 283 in appendices, which I'll turn there really quickly. And yes, let's see. All right. I'm not going to read the whole thing right now. Okay. All right. "Coming just like they have for 1,000 years, finish up your breakfast and we'll go out onto the town. The chores will wait." With a loud crash, the back door burst open and there stood Poto, drenched with sweat and out of breath. "Thwaps!" he bellowed, holding out a sack with something squirming and screeching inside. Poto smacked it with his club and the squealing promptly stopped. Nugget yipped and danced at his feet, nipping at the sack. "There are 2 more little stinkers out there, but these 3, he shook the sack, "won't be munching on any more of our vegetables, I can tell you that. Lousy, thieving little flaps." He noticed his 3 grandchildren and his daughter watching him and cleared his throat. "Don't worry now. I'll be tossing them off the cliff straight into the dark sea after I eat a few of your fine hotcakes, honey." He nodded to Nia, trying to sound less gruff. Nia's mouth dropped open. "How could you throw them into the sea?" Poto scratched his head. "Easy, see? I'll take this sack here and I dump it out over the cliff. Simple as that." Lily sat with her fork in her hand and a look of horror on her face. "Grandpa, you can't just kill them." She pushed back from the table as the boys rolled their eyes. She hobbled on her crutch to her towering grandfather and looked up at him with a pitiful sweetness in her eyes. Poto loved his little granddaughter like nothing else in Ariar, and she knew it. "They're such sweet things, Grandpa, and they never harm anyone." Poto sputtered and pointed to the scratches on his arms. Lily didn't seem to notice. "And all they take is a few of our vegetables each year to feed their baby thwaplings. I can't believe that you would do such a thing. Please, Grandpa, don't kill the little fuzzies." She grabbed his shirt, pulled his face to hers, and kissed him on a grizzled cheek. "Come on, Nugget," she said, and she left the kitchen. The sack squealed, and Poto smacked it again, but with less vigor. With a grunt, Poto plopped the sack on the floor beside the table and shoveled a hotcake into his mouth. "Now, Janna, lad," Poto said without looking up from his plate, "it can get rowdy out there with the festivities going on, and you know the fangs get even meaner when it looks like we screens are having a grand time of it." "Yes, sir." Janna looked down at his plate and clenched the sides of his chair, bracing himself for what he knew was coming. "And you're the oldest, which bears a noble responsibility. It means that I have to keep an eye on Tink and Lily and make sure they get home safely. I've heard the same thing every day of my life, and I'm not stupid." Janner surprised even himself. His cheeks reddened when he saw the look of shock on his mother's face. He knew he had gone too far, but it was too late to turn back. Years of frustration decided to explode over hotcakes that very morning. "What it means is that I'm a nanny, that I never get to do anything I want to do." Tink snorted and tried to hide his laughter by shoving another bite into his mouth. Janner kicked him under the table, which only made Tink snort again. "I don't want to spend my life fretting over Tink and Lily, following 2 little kids around, fussing over them like an old woman, wasting my life." "Son," Poto started. I'm not your son. You're not my father, and if my father were alive, he'd understand. Jenner already hated himself for what he had said. He was breathing hard, staring at the stove, afraid to look at his grandfather's face. His chest felt hot and tears were coming. He put a hand in his pocket and squeezed the folded drawing of his father. Like never before, he wished he were on that boat, out on the dark sea of darkness, far away from Glipwood and from the way he felt right now. Poto chewed and swallowed his hotcakes slowly, considering his grandson in heavy silence. Tink, clear your plate and go get dressed, he said without taking his eyes off of Janner. Nia stood by the stove looking at the floor with her hands on her hips. The grizzled old man wiped his mouth with a napkin and gripped the sides of the table with his big hands. Janner was in trouble. He knew it. And that ends chapter 3.